Welcome officially to our second education seminar. Unfortunately, unlike the first one we had, you're not going to get any delicious cheeses to taste today. It is equally interesting topic. Some of you know anything around the FDA is hugely important to how we do business, and certainly the FSVP part of the FSMA rule is exactly that. If there are any questions that may come up throughout or will come up throughout the presentation, please use the chat box. We have set aside half an hour at the end of the presentation so that these questions can specifically get answered. That is it from me. Do enjoy. I would like to now introduce Michael Myers. He is the Educational Seminar Chair, and we'll go into a little bit more specifics as it pertains to this afternoon's presentation. Thank you very much again and enjoy.
Thanks, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CIAA's Education Seminar on the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, FDA's expectations for the import of safe foods. The formal presentation will end around 2:30, and we have reserved the last 30 minutes for question and answers. So with that being said, I'm pleased to introduce Seth Mailhot and Emily Lyons from Husch Blackwell. Seth Mailhot is a partner at Husch Blackwell and has also worked out and works out of the Washington, D.C. office. Seth began his career as a chemical engineer for more than a decade at the FDA, conducting regulatory research, performing inspections of regulated industry, and serving as a compliance officer, followed by nearly 15 years in private practice. As a leader of the firm's FDA group, Seth handles a broad array of matters involving FDA-regulated products and services. Among other clients, Seth counsels food producers, importers, restaurants, trade groups, farms, and manufacturers of food packaging materials and food additives. Emily Lyons is a senior associate at Husch Blackwell and also works out of the Washington, D.C. office. Lyons grew up on a northern Illinois dairy farm and now helps clients bridge the gap from farm to fork. Lyons guides clients on complex regulatory issues as they bring dairy products, beverages, fruits and vegetables, processed foods, alcohol beverages, and other agricultural goods to market. So with that being said, Seth and Emily, please take it away.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here. We're going to be talking about FSVP, which is FDA, one of the tools that FDA uses to ensure the safety of imported food in the United States. Just to give you guys a perspective on where things have gone since FDA really started looking at imports. I mean, you can see from 1999 to 2017, the volume of food imports has nearly doubled. It's probably gone way past doubling at this point. But even before, when we had 9/11, FDA has taken a particular focus on food import issues with the prior notice requirements and following up on other import requirements. So one of the things I'll point out is some of the differences between domestic enforcement and enforcement over foreign manufacturers. When we talk about the differences in how FDA has its enforcement capabilities, domestic facilities or domestic producers are regulated within the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the enforcement tools that FDA has are restricted to seizure and injunction tools from the legal perspective. Now, when you're talking about seizure and taking those types of judicial tools, for FDA, it takes an awful long time. They have to go through court process. They have to, work with the Department of Justice in order to get those tools enforced, because FDA doesn't have the authority on its own to initiate these legal proceedings. So for that reason, FDA largely relies on warning letters, press releases, and other tools that it has at its disposal. Now, for the import side, it's different. For importers, FDA has sort of the ability to block imports at the point of entry into the country. It can do that based on the appearance of an adulteration or misbranding claim, which means the goods in question don't have to actually be adulterated or misbranded in order to be blocked. And this appearance of adulteration or appearance of misbranding can be based on, insanitary conditions that are seen at the foreign facility, the restrictions that the country in which produced the goods places on the goods in question, whether the goods in question are in compliance with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which we'll spend this entire session discussing, or not in compliance with certain record-keeping requirements for tracking and tracing of food, which will be implemented at some point in the future, but currently we only have, very preliminary rule from FDA on this. When we talk about the appearance of adulteration, that doesn't mean the good, as I said, has to be adulterated. It only has to have the appearance of adulteration. And because of that language, there's really no ability to challenge FDA's decision in a court of law over a certain good. So if your goods are held based on the belief of FDA that they may be adulterated, that product then, there we go, that product can be refused by FDA and there's no recourse. Essentially the one exception would be is if the good in question wasn't regulated by FDA. So if the FDA is basing its decision that it's an adulterated drug, for example, and you can prove that the good isn't a drug, well, then you can get around this barrier to importing your product. But otherwise, you're pretty much stuck and there's no way to challenge it absent working with the FDA to overcome this objection that it has. Just so you know, there's also no requirement for FDA to collect reserve samples for imports, but generally FDA will collect a reserve sample as part of its policy, but you can't, require FDA to do that. So because of this, broad authority, FDA asserts that it has the ability to inspect foreign manufacturing facilities. But even if they didn't, have that legal authority to do it, if you were to deny FDA the ability to inspect the foreign facility, that may be enough of a basis for FDA to say, well, it's the appearance of adulteration because you refused us the ability to do the inspection. But notwithstanding, under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Section 704, as well as 807B, FDA does have this ability to do inspections. Now, as I said, because inspection refusals can mean that FDA determines that you are failing to show that you don't have the appearance of adulteration, this inspection refusal requires you to respond within 24 hours after FDA submits an inspection request. That said, because of the logistics, FDA generally gives companies about a month to 2 month lead time with which they'll notify you about the intent to inspect. You would respond back, and then FDA can then schedule the inspection at a predetermined time. So there are a number of sections that address food imports. You've got the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which is what we'll be talking about. We'll also be talking a bit about the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program, which is a way to, expedite imports. There's certification for food imports under Section 801Q. The prior notice, which was a section that was added during the aftermath of 9/11, where all imported food needs to be, where notifications about the upcoming importation of food needs to be notified to FDA in advance of it arriving. Inspection of foreign food facilities, which gives FDA greater authority to do inspections. Accreditation of third-party auditors, which we'll also be mentioning later. FDA, following 9/11, has also set up foreign offices to give it more expedited ability to do inspections. There's also a section on food smuggling and compliance with international agreements, where FDA can recognize foreign authorities' decisions or determinations on the quality of food in order to import the food into the United States. But what we'll really be talking about here are the amendments that were made as part of the Food Safety Modernization Act. All of these are meant to sort of work together as a network. You've got preventive controls that address both human food and animal food. You've got the produce safety standards, which are more farm-based, raw agricultural product steps, that measures that should be taken. We've got the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which helps to ensure the quality and safety of food that's produced outside of FDA's direct jurisdiction. You get third-party accreditation, which gives FDA sort of a helping hand by having third-party organizations do some of the reviews and inspections. You get the sanitary transport rule and the intentional adulteration rule, which was also an issue that, where not all adulteration was occurring when food was produced in transit, or if food was being produced below FDA's quality standards. In some cases, food could actually be tampered with, oftentimes within the production facility, whether it's by disgruntled employees or others with a more malicious intent. But we're going to be talking about the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So I'm going to switch it over to Emily, and she's going to give us a run through of the more specific requirements of that rule.
Thanks, Seth. Like you said, I'm going to kind of dive a lot deeper into the specific requirements and details of FSVP. And like Seth mentioned, the point and incorporation of FSVP into the Food Safety Modernization Act was really to put the onus of ensuring that safe food is imported into the country on the entity or individual that is importing that food into the US. Because USDA or FDA only has, certain jurisdiction over foreign facilities, they've always done foreign inspections for food facilities, specifically for the CGMPs prior to the, authorization of FSMA. But really, it did not dig down as deep as the preventive controls rule and the requirements of the Food Safety Modernization Act. And really, their authority, they thought, really started at the border prior to FSMA. This now requires you as the importer to go past the border and really focus on working with the suppliers of a food in order to ensure that it is produced in a way that is at least as safe as the preventive controls requirements for domestic food process. So again, as Seth kind of mentioned, these programs work very well together and are meant to kind of have some overlapping requirements depending on the role that you have within the food chain. And the FSVP requirement very closely aligns with the supply chain provisions of the preventive controls rules. If any of you happen to also have domestic manufacturing, practices or facilities here in the US, you'll be familiar with those requirements in the preventive controls rule. And they again focus on you going at least one step back to the actual manufacturer of that initial, whether it's a raw ingredient or finished product, and making sure again that the preventive controls rules are being followed. And really what this does is this allows foreign suppliers to produce food that use processes and procedures that meet the same public health protection as FSMA, as I mentioned a little bit ago. And then also, while it's mostly focused on the prevention of introduction of hazards to foods or controlling those hazards, they also look and require you to help focus you on the other more general adulteration and misbranding provisions that fall under the FDCA. So it does provide you an opportunity to have potentially more control over products that are coming in consumer packages and have appropriate labeling, therefore would not be misbranded and denied entry. And then another really key thing to remember under FSVP, and I'm sure you are all very familiar with this, is that on your entry documents, you're required to provide information regarding who the FSVP importer is. And we're going to talk about that very key definition in just a minute, as well as provide information regarding the name and contract on that entry, generally because your broker will not necessarily be the importer of record and your FSVP importer may not be the importer of record. It gets a little complicated, where FDA really wanted to focus FSMA on who is most responsible for ensuring safety of the food and actually has control and ownership of that food. So like I said, we're going to talk about how FDA defines importer under the rule. And it is generally going to be the owner or consignee of a food at the time of entry. But as we know as importers, there's not always an owner or consignee depending on how your business operates. So in those cases, it may be a US agent or a representative of a foreign owner of a food. And this is done through a confirmed signed statement saying that, yes, as a US agent, I am willing to act, or a foreign representative of this company, I am the one with responsibilities under FSVP. And this is the individual or the entity that is responsible for compliance with the FSVP rule. And like I mentioned, this does not always mean that it is the importer of record for customs purposes. Sometimes they may be the same entity, sometimes they are not. And this is an area that FDA, when Seth talks about enforcement, is very focused on. They want to make sure that the appropriate entity is, one, identified on import documentation, and two, also actually complying with the FSVP importer requirements. Now, another definition that's important is the foreign supplier. And that seems, it's pretty standard. It's whoever is manufacturing or processing that food, raising an animal if you're bringing in animal-based products. For example, shelled eggs would be something that would fall there. Or if you're bringing in produce or a raw agricultural commodity, it would be the grower of that food that ships it into the US without further processing or manufacturing. So they will potentially fall under other rules that Seth mentioned under the Food Safety Modernization Act. For example, the manufacturers and processors would fall under the preventive controls rule, whereas a raw agricultural commodity or produce would fall under the produce safety rule. So you just need to know, FSMA is meant for you to be the main regulated entity by FDA, but also making sure that your foreign supplier is meeting these requirements.
Just wanted to clarify something for everyone that, when we talk about the importer, the FDA's preference based on its enforcement has been that it's the owner or consignee of the food at the time of US entry. So even if you are the owner or consignee and you happen to have a signed statement that the US agent or representative is going to serve as the FSVP owner or consignee, FDA won't recognize that. So the preference is the actual owner or consignee, and you can't sort of delegate that to the US agent or representative.
And the distinction between that is that you actually own the food or are the consignee of the food. The US agent or representative of a foreign agency can only come into play when there is no entity in the United States that owns or acts as the consignee of the good. That's where, yes, it can be those, but it is an if no kind of situation. So most of the time it is going to be there will be an owner or consignee of the food, even if you think that that's not really the case. And that's something, you should work closely with both your customers and potentially legal counsel to make sure that you've appropriately designated who the actual FSVP importer is. Because Seth and I have worked on a couple of cases where they had this signed statement, but there was an owner or consignee at the time of entry, and therefore FSVP was not being met.
And typically they'll look to the CBP documents, the import documents, to see who's identified as the initial importer or the importer of record.
Right, but those definitions are different. So we're going to talk a little bit about a qualified individual. We'll mention that. I may say, SVP, QI, or anything like that, but I'm going to try and say qualified individual. And this person is really key in establishing your FSVP plan and compliance with the regulations. These are generally individuals who either have education, training, or expertise necessary to perform the requirements of FSVP that we're going to dig in deeper on. They're generally food safety experts who can help you establish and evaluate hazards, determine what is appropriate to control those hazards, really help you build out your plan and make sure that it is compliant legally, not necessarily legally, but really scientifically to appropriately control hazards. And they're very important, not only for that education and training, but they also need to have, especially because we're talking about foreign foods, they need to be able to read and understand the record of any language of the importing country. So either they need to work with reliable translators in order to assist them in translating those documents and ensuring that they've been able to actually review them. And that's one thing that has come up in some of the FDA inspections that Seth will talk about later is you may have used an appropriate person who is qualified, but they actually cannot read the documents that are being reviewed to help build the FSVP. And therefore, FDA is kind of like, I don't understand how you can set up a compliant plan if you actually can't read what the manufacturing facility is doing. And then also another key definition that probably won't apply to too many on this call, but it is very small importers. And we'll talk about why that's important later, but they are importers that average less than $1 million per year, adjusted for inflation during a 3-year period. So they have some special status under FSVP and different requirements than small businesses and large businesses under FSVP. So before we dig into the details of FSVP, there are a number of firms and types of foods that are actually exempt from FSVP and can be imported without identifying an FSVP importer and having the plan backing it up. These include foods such as juice produced under a juice HACCP or a seafood HACCP regulation. And you need to follow those import requirements, which FDA also has. They're separate and in FDA's eyes meet a similar health protection standard as the preventive controls requirements because they're regulated separately. Additionally, foods that are used for research or evaluation, or if you're bringing food in yourself for personal consumption, but not looking to retail that. Again, that's not going to apply to most of us as importing companies. Additionally, alcoholic beverages and ingredients for alcoholic beverages, which it needs to be very clear that that's what the ingredient is being used for. I would say, though, the large scale of ingredients for alcoholic beverages are generally imported under an FSVP, just because they can be used in traditional foods as well as alcoholic beverages. Additionally, foods that are transshipped through the US, which means they're imported for the purpose of being basically shipped across the US or somewhere else in the US to then be exported. as well as foods that are imported into the US to a processing facility for processing, but then are not meant to enter US commerce and then are directly exported. Additionally, we have foods that are returned to the US. So for example, something that was produced here in the US and was at a foreign country or went to a foreign country, but then was eventually returned without any further manufacturing, which includes processing, relabeling, repackaging, any of those activities, where it just basically stayed in its same package that it was shipped out in, was not subject to any further activities, and then was brought back into the US. Meat, poultry, and egg products, which fall under USDA's jurisdiction, also do not require FSVP because the Food Safety Inspection Service at USDA has separate import requirements for those. Like I mentioned, we would talk about very small importers. They are also exempt from the majority of the FSVP requirements, and we'll talk a little bit about those in just a minute. Low canned acidified foods, so if you're making any or importing any of those LACF foods, they're exempt only again from portions of FSVP. You still need to have a plan and follow the LACF requirements to import those foods, but they are exempt from evaluating microbial hazards as that is appropriately done through the process authority process. However, other hazards would need to be addressed in your FSVP. And then also if you are a receiving facility, and the way that I kind of think of that is I'm a manufacturer here in the US and I am accepting a raw ingredient or raw material, and then I'm going to further process that. They have specific, again, the supply chain requirements that they're required to follow under the preventive controls rule, which are in Part 117, as shown on the slide. So they're technically exempt from FSVP, but they do meet the preventive controls requirements elsewhere to address hazards present in those foods. As to very small importers, like I mentioned, they're generally exempt from the majority of the FSVP requirements. However, very small importers are required to meet some minimum requirements outlined by FDA. And that includes maintaining and following an FSVP made by an individual that has, adequate assurances of the foreign suppliers. They also must properly identify the importer with FDA and CBP at import, but they're otherwise exempt from the other provisions, such as the re-verification and supplier verification requirements that we'll talk a little bit about in just a bit. And as I mentioned, those receiving facilities, this is just a further explanation of that. They are not required to meet the full FSVP requirements, but they do have to have a responsible FSVP identified at entry. However, otherwise, they're generally exempt because they are meeting the supply chain requirements of the preventive controls for human food rule. So we talked a lot about who might be required to comply, and I would say it's the majority of foods that are imported into the US. Definitely the cheese, butter, dairy products of the individuals who are on this call need to meet these requirements. And this is kind of the different elements that you would include in an FSVP plan and are required in order to comply. So we'll dig down deep into each of these areas, but just as a high-level overview, in addition to ensuring that your foreign suppliers follow the preventive controls rule, you also, as an FSVP reporter, are required to conduct a hazard analysis that identifies known or reasonably foreseeable biological, chemical, and physical hazards, which is also what your foreign suppliers are required to do under the preventive controls rule. You have to evaluate and approve each foreign supplier, as well as evaluate the foods, which is part of that hazard analysis. You then also determine what foreign supplier verification activities are necessary and appropriate in order to make sure that the foreign supplier is actually controlling identified hazards, and then also determine what frequency you will conduct those verification activities. Additionally, you need to take corrective actions based upon the outcomes in your verification activities. So say one of your verification activities is an on-site audit and you notice that there are certain deviations that they're making from their preventive controls food safety plan, what corrective actions are you going to take in order to make sure that they are actually meeting those PC requirements? Additionally, you're required to reevaluate your FSVP, either one, when you become aware of a food safety program associated with a food that is covered by that FSVP, and then also at least every 3 years. Additionally, these are requirements that isn't a part of your plan, but I'm going to keep reiterating it. You have to identify your FSVP or importer at the time of entry. And additionally, all of the issues listed above, you need to keep adequate records. A lot of what FSMA has done is taken us, yes, we're taking more activities and doing more things to ensure food safety, but we are also keeping a lot of records and a lot of documentation. Especially for importers, that's important since most of the manufacturing will not be occurring at all in your facilities, and you'll have very little control over that. So when FDA conducts inspections, your documents need to say what steps you take, what hazards you've evaluated, really all of this information, so they can say, yes, you are meeting those requirements and are making sure that your foreign supplier is actually meeting the preventive controls requirements. So specifically on the hazard analysis, you really need to identify a number of hazards and really dig deep into one, both what your foreign supplier has done by complying with the preventive controls, but also kind of conduct your own hazard analysis to make sure that they've contemplated everything in their own plans. So you must, in writing, again, this all has to be written down based upon experience with the food itself, illness and injury data potentially generated, scientific reports, and other information. So a great example is if you have a raw milk cheese, we know of certain microbial pathogens that are more commonly, associated with them. And one that's always of concern to FDA in any cheese is Listeria. So that is based on both experience potentially, as well as illness data and scientific reports that would indicate to us that that is very likely a hazard that needs to be identified and addressed in our FSVP plan. And the only hazards that have to actually be included in your plan are ones that are known or reasonably foreseeable. And that's really the key language. And you have to look at it for each food. You can, in some instances, group different, certain categories of food. However, you do need to take into consideration in those groupings whether or not it's actually appropriate to group those types of foods. I would not recommend ever to say, I just have a food or a cheese FSVP. You would need to consider maybe your soft rind cheeses could be controlled under one FSVP from a specific importer. Whereas if you also are importing hard cheeses, those, because they have different potential hazards, both microbial as well as potentially physical, that you could group those together in your plans and your hazard analysis. The hazards that you have to evaluate, like I mentioned, we're very focused on microbial hazards, but you also need to consider chemical hazards. Those can include things like pesticides or antibiotics, which is very important, obviously, in dairy production, and something that needs to be closely evaluated, as well as radiological, which some people may be like, why do we need to worry about that? Well, FDA, obviously, when the Fukushima nuclear power plant had that core breakdown following the tsunami, there was some radiological fallout in Japan that required dairy processors in the area to really figure out how to deal with that radiological drift and impact to theirs, and whether or not we could import dairy products from Japan, for example. And as I mentioned, these hazards may be naturally occurring. We deal with pathogens all the time. They could also be unintentionally introduced. And then FDA also wants you as a foreign supplier to think about intentional introduction of foods for economic gain. If we remember several years ago, the melamine scandal in China related to dairy products, that's something that they're always would like you to consider. But really, the economic adulteration areas really would focus potentially on regions of the world or potential suppliers that you may have indications where there may be economic motivation for adulterating your food, but it's not as wide scale or as important as some of these other areas, but it is something that you need to consider while conducting your hazard analysis. Additionally, as part of this hazard analysis, so you've identified that a hazard may exist, but in order to determine if it's known or reasonably foreseeable and it needs to be addressed in your plan, you need to evaluate the severity of the illness or injury that could occur, as well as the probability that it will occur in the absence of a preventive control. Again, this mirrors the preventive controls requirements if you've ever had to deal with those as a domestic producer and processor. It's basically if you don't control that hazard or your supplier is not controlling that hazard. It's difficult sometimes in raw milk cheeses, but if we compared that to a pasteurized cheese, they would have different potential hazards present. And pasteurization would be the control or the preventive control in the case for a pasteurized based milk cheese. Additionally, ready-to-eat foods, you need to evaluate if the food is exposed to the environment prior to packaging. That's something we have to consider, especially for our aged cheeses or anything that has a soft rind and is sitting on wood boards, which we know that is a whole nother issue that FDA has looked at and given us the okay to do with proper aging times. Additionally, you need to consider whether or not packaged foods receive some kind of treatment that would significantly minimize the pathogen. There are some ways that you can minimize pathogens through packaging, whether it's use of some kind of antimicrobial agent or something else to help reduce the potential for a microbial hazard. Again, that's kind of where that would focus in on the ready-to-eat food, assuming that there's no other chemical or other physical hazard that can't be addressed otherwise. And then additionally, one thing that FDA is always very focused on is evaluations of environmental pathogens. Listeria is always number one when you think about environmental pathogens. So that's something that needs to be considered in your plans. What environmental pathogens may be potentially present or are important for the type of product that you're importing. Additionally, this is a list of some other risks that you need to evaluate in your FSVP hazard analysis. It's things like the formulation of the food. Is there something in there specifically that would address whatever hazard could be present, or could that itself present a hazard in the food? The design of the facility and the equipment. Those are things that you should consider, as well as the types of raw materials and ingredients and where those are sourced from. Are there any manufacturing processes or procedures that either could reduce or address a hazard? Same with packaging, how the product is stored. FDA really wants you to look at every single step in the process. Now, there are a couple of ways that you can meet this hazard analysis requirement. You can either conduct your own, or you can review a hazard analysis that's conducted by the foreign supplier or another entity. This has to be done, though, by a qualified individual who actually can read the language, as I said, and really ensure that that suppliers and that foreign supplier or the other entity who made that hazard analysis actually did their right job. And that means you have to document, again, that that is how you conducted your hazard analysis and what information that qualified individual looked at regarding this. There are also on-site audits that can and should be done under the rule, but note that an FSVP importer cannot simply just rely on an on-site audit that was conducted by a foreign supplier or by a third, like a government entity, unless they are reviewing it under the preventive controls rule. So for example, the importer must be a qualified auditor under the FSVP rules. Same with any third party that you could do, or have an FDA audit that could potentially be looked at under the regulations. I would say by far and large, most entities are not necessarily using that type of hazard analysis just on its own. most companies and FDA really does expect you to conduct your own hazard analysis. They want you to follow the trust but verify. You trust what they say, but you need to verify and really dig into the hazards on your own to make sure that they're adequately addressed so that you're not even importing any type of adulterated food. And in some instances, you may not be required to conduct verification activities like an on-site audit. And that's if you've done a proper hazard analysis and there are absolutely no known or reasonably foreseeable hazards in the food, then you are not required to conduct the verification activities, which is kind of one of the next steps in part of your FSVP plan. It doesn't happen very often, but that may be the case for certain commodities. And then also a supplier verification program, or at least not necessarily the program, but the verification requirements of FSVP may not be required if there are preventive controls that are implemented by you as the importer or your customer, and those preventive controls actually address the hazard and significantly minimize or prevent that hazard. And then also this has to be documented in writing every year, saying if you dealt with the preventive controls requirements, this is kind of called the written assurances provision, but it basically says, I've been notified about this hazard and I accept responsibility for addressing this hazard. Again, the majority of importers or your customers are probably not going to take this, since we are generally importing finished products that our further processing is generally cut and wrapping or making shredding products, those kinds of things. We're not necessarily doing a type of manufacturing that has a kill step or any kind of true preventive control where you're controlling that hazard or going in for cooking or manufacturing the product, unless you're potentially making like a processed cheese here in the US from some imported ingredients. So one of the things that you need to do if you're going to be reviewing your food and your foreign supplier is really review your supplier risks. And these are kind of the questions that FDA wants you to focus in on. I'm not going to read them to you, but really you need to look for any factors that are important regarding how the food is produced. What hazards are they actually identifying? How are they controlling them? Again, because you're required to do a lot of written things, what does the foreign supplier have written down regarding processes, procedures, and are they actually following them and documented that they followed them? For example, do they have a sanitation schedule as part of their preventive controls requirements? And then do their sanitation documents actually meet that? That's part of your risk analysis and review and evaluation of those foreign suppliers to determine whether or not there's a risk or a hazard you need to identify in your plan, and further say you need to do more foreign supplier because I don't think you're meeting the preventive controls requirements. Again, because FDA is asking you to kind of step into their role a little bit as kind of like a supply chain regulator to ensure that your foreign suppliers are doing what they're supposed to do. Because as Seth kind of indicated, we have a lot of food imported into the country, but FDA is not able and does not have the inspection force to go out and inspect, let alone every domestic facility in the US, but all the foreign facilities also that are importing foods into the US. So they're asking you to kind of take on that role. In addition, you have to have written procedures that ensures that your foods are only coming from your approved foreign suppliers that have had your risk evaluation done through your hazard analysis. This is something that's common in really kind of any food safety program. You may have vetted a supplier, but you need to actually make sure that your supplier is who they say they are and is actually the one who's providing you the product that you receive. Additionally, you may be able to use unapproved foreign suppliers. However, you do need to do some supply chain vetting and foreign supplier verification before using or distributing that product. Again, that's something that with all the supply chain difficulties that we're having currently getting imported foods into the US, that may be an instance where you use it, but that is not something that wide-scale FDA would see as appropriate in order for you to bring certain products into the US. And then again, you have to document the procedures and the steps that you take to follow them. Write it all down. It sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but that is the only way that FDA really has the ability to review what you're doing and whether or not you and your foreign suppliers are actually doing what's required. So again, on verification procedures, you have to conduct a foreign supplier verification activity to show that your foreign suppliers are following processes and procedures, specifically that they are meeting the preventive controls for human foods requirements and in compliance with all the other FDA requirements related to food. So you need to conduct at least one, generally it is more, generally you're conducting multiple verification activities for each of your foreign suppliers. Generally, the ones that are taken are on-site audits performed by what's known as a qualified auditor under the regulations. You may be sampling or testing foods, as well as making sure that you're reviewing your supplier's relevant food safety records. And there may be other activities that you identify that are appropriate. Some of these other appropriate activities are outlined in FDA's FSVP guidance documents, which if you have not dug through those, they are very, very helpful in identifying additional areas where some activities may come up. I would say FDA says or really views on-site audits as kind of the gold standard for verification activities. I will recognize, and I know FDA has during COVID, that an on-site audit of a foreign facility is impractical, if not impossible. So therefore, they were not necessarily requiring FSVP importers to conduct those over the last year and a half. But they should then implement other verification activities, such as reviews of food safety records, as well as potentially the preventive controls plan again, in order to verify that the foods coming into the US were compliant. You also need to document, this is again in your plan, what verification activities you're doing and why they're appropriate, as well as the frequency upon which you as the FSVP importer will be doing them. And you need to put this in writing and sign it and date it per the FDA regulations. FDA likes to get some technical citations out every once in a while on you not signing and dating appropriate records. Please make sure that you're following those requirements. It's just something small that overall is not likely going to result in a warning letter, but it is an area that FDA has seen some entities not necessarily following those requirements. And in some instances, we talked about on-site audits and how it's really kind of the gold standard and when they may be required under the rule or when it would be the most appropriate verification activity. And that is when there is a hazard that you've identified that is not controlled by the foreign supplier, and it prevents SACOTA, which is FDA's fun, really great abbreviation for severe adverse health consequences or death in humans or animals. And the way to kind of remember that is if you've ever been involved in a recall situation, a class 1 recall is a SACOTA hazard. So that's kind of how these interplay with those. So if there is the SACOTA hazard that is not controlled by the foreign supplier in some way that is either appropriate or required under the preventive controls rule, an on-site audit would be absolutely required. And like I mentioned before, this can be conducted by the importer, so long as they're a qualified auditor, FDA, or a third-party auditor. But note, FDA is not going to be at those facilities every single year. And if you have an annual on-site audit requirement, you cannot just plan to rely on an FDA audit of a foreign facility. And then again, you may document this verification activity as well as others that are adequate to demonstrate food safety. And note that you would need to conduct both an initial audit and then your kind of on-site additional audits and those frequencies. An on-site audit might not be as necessary when an importer can rely on an inspection by a foreign supplier by the Food Safety Authority. But these are in really, really limited instances. One, it's when FDA has officially recognized a food safety system. This is known as program recognition, and we have very few of those programs, like very few, where FDA has systems recognition, where they recognize a foreign government's food safety program as providing the at least minimum the same amount of public health protection as the FDCA and the requirements under the Food Safety Modernization Act. And Seth, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if we actually have any systems recognitions for a full food safety program. We have some for certain molluscan shellfish coming from France and Spain, but overall, there are very few system recognitions that would cover most, if any, dairy products.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. And something to also point out here, when we're talking about different techniques on doing this verification, the on-site audit, while really difficult under the present circumstances, is generally the preferred method. Now, maybe there's methods to use like a virtual audit where you do more of a doc review followed up by an interview with the relevant personnel at the facility. But actual analytical sample testing is oftentimes doesn't work as well. Emily and I can probably share a number of instances where you can do testing on iterative samples and get results, positive, negative, in between. And really, it's not indicative of the actual state of quality of the product. So sample testing oftentimes isn't a good solution to fill in for on-site audits.
I totally agree. Usually I hear testing, doing finished product testing is looking for a needle in a haystack, or you can't test yourself into compliance. So that's why, again, FDA really focuses on on-site audits, and why they provided this kind of very narrow exception that at this point, there are almost no FSVP importers that can use it. And again, that inspection, so you have that, you're required to have systems recognition, and then also the inspection that you're relying on had to have been conducted within 1 year of the date that the audit would have been required for you to conduct under your FSVP. And like I mentioned before, there's also some reevaluation that's required. One of the things about all of the FSMA regulations is FDA kind of wants this to be an iterative process. You're constantly updating your plans in order to address new risks or food safety risks that are identified, whether you discover them or you're notified by a supplier regarding one, or we just start seeing additional information in the literature regarding a specific food safety hazard. For example, this is focused on domestic products because we don't import too much ice cream, but I would say 10 years ago, we didn't really see Listeria monocytogenes as an issue in the ice cream industry, but now that is the #1 environmental pathogen of concern for the ice cream industry. So initially, that may not have been a hazard that was highly addressed under your food safety plan or your FSVP plan, but now it would be if you're importing ice cream. So again, that's one of those, you found that out, now you needed to reevaluate your plans. Again, you're going to need to decide whether to continue using a supplier. Both if you discover this food safety risk, or you're notified of a potential food safety issue by the supplier, or if FDA or a state is conducting sampling, as we know they do, for continuous monitoring of the food supply. Additionally, you are at minimum required to evaluate your FSVP at least once every 3 years, or again, if you have this new information. And then also you need to promptly, and yes, the regulations say promptly, which does not help anyone, but promptly implement any changes that you make to your FSVP within your own systems. Whether it's you identify that a new verification activity needs to occur, you need to promptly, which FDA has provided no guidance, and we haven't had any enforcement on what is not prompt, but you do need to look at those changes. And then just also under the regulations, so you've got all of those requirements. You have to establish your FSVP plan. You have to verify that it's working. You have to take corrective actions when it's not. vet all of your suppliers, make sure that you're actually getting food from these suppliers. Oh, but also you've got a few other requirements. You're also required to comply with the preventive controls for human food supply chain provisions. Now, these are, like I said earlier, almost identical to the preventive control or to the FSVP program. So generally you can use your FSVP to meet those supply chain requirements. Additionally, if you are importing a food that has an uncontrolled hazard that needs to be controlled because it has a reasonably foreseeable to cause illness or injury, you would then need to potentially implement your own preventive control. Additionally, you may also not be required to implement a preventive control if there are certain preventive controls provisions that allow you to not do that. Again, you also would need to identify yourself as the FSVP importer at import. And then if you're an importer who's conducting additional activities here in the US, cutting and wrapping, relabeling, repackaging, grading, any of the great value added activities that we conduct to bulk products that we're importing, those actually subject you then to the full preventive controls for human food requirements because you are conducting that additional processing or manufacturing here in the US, and there's the potential for you to introduce new hazards. So you can't just kind of stop where you're at. If you're meeting FSVP and doing additional activities here in the US, you may pull in additional regulations under FSMA. And before Seth starts talking to you about what to inspect for inspections and all of that, we know the compliance dates are long gone for both large importers as well as small importers. One thing that we just want to remind you of is if you are importing a product that for some reason was previously not covered by the preventive controls rule or the produce safety regulations, but then the foreign supplier is now subject to those requirements, you as an importer have to comply with FSVP within 6 months after the supplier is required to meet those regulations. So there's a little bit of lag time to allow the foreign supplier is now newly complying with the requirements, and you as the importer then have that 6-month window to set up your FSVP and begin implementing things. Does that mean that it's going to be easy to import those products? No, but you will be identifying yourself as the FSVP importer. But if FDA does come to inspect you in between that 6-month window, they should not take enforcement action in that period of time for that new product that you're bringing into the country. And then there are enforcement provisions or enforcement discretion. So that means FDA is not taking enforcement for not meeting those requirements. That includes the written assurances provisions. And it's partially because FDA is going to revamp those regulations at some time in the future. These have indeterminate enforcement discretion. So FDA did not put a hard date on when it would start enforcing these requirements, mostly because they intend on fixing them or updating them for all of these different products. So different areas, written assurances, those who are importing food contact substances, because of how FDA defined the term food in FSVP, it actually covered food contact substances, but the preventive controls rule doesn't cover it. That was a fun thing for FDA to kind of discover after the regs were issued. If you're importing grain as a raw agricultural commodity, FSVP is not currently being required. However, if you are importing a raw agricultural commodity as grain, but it's going into animal feed, you may need to meet those requirements. And then also importers of live animals that are going to be slaughtered at a USDA regulated facility would not need to, has enforcement discretion to where FDA is going to clarify that in the regulations that those live animals are also exempt. So now that I provided an overview of the regulation itself and what you need to do to comply, Seth is going to walk you through kind of what we've learned since FDA started enforcing and inspecting against these rules since May 30th of 2017.
Thanks. So One point to going back, I know we talked about the 3-year look back on reevaluating. Just to point out, if you found that there were no known hazards, it's a yearly reevaluation, not a 3-year. But anyway, what have we learned so far? I mean, a lot of this, when they first announced this new requirement, it struck me that FDA would take its normal approach, which would be to have this introductory period where FDA's inspections would point out potential deficiencies, remind industry about the requirements, and then have a pause on anything more involved as far as enforcement goes. We've entered the next phase, which is targeting companies that are subject to FSVP that have not implemented anything at all. And we'll talk a bit about that in the warning letter requirements. But at this point, we're seeing FDA moving into regulation. They're starting to ask more serious questions and dig a little deeper into some of the rationale of what importers are doing as far as following the FSVP requirements, whether it's identifying the US agent as the party responsible for carrying out FSVP when there's a known importer on the record, or other issues. They're starting to step into that next level now, where it's not just focus on whether or not you have an FSVP program in place. The investigators are asking for training records, which is fairly routine, but it is something that shows that next step, testing out whether the individuals that are quote unquote qualified actually have the necessary training or responsibilities in order to do those types of reviews. We're seeing that investigators are examining environmental monitoring programs to ensure that identified hazards are being appropriately identified. Looking at inspections, including multiple foreign suppliers of food. Inspections because of COVID, we'll talk a little bit about this. There's a requirement now where FDA has implemented an electronic review of records for FSVP compliance. This is a relatively new approach. Traditionally, FDA's done its inspections in person and has, by and large, not wanted to collect records remotely or submit requests of regulated industry. If they needed records, they would initiate an inspection and go out and collect the records. Now with COVID, we're seeing virtual FSVP inspections going on. So that's been a new approach to how FDA is regulating. There's, as I mentioned, some of the issues are coming up as to who is the appropriate FSVP importer under the FSVP rule. FDA has its own view and generally will look towards the entity taking possession of the goods at import in the US as opposed to the US agent being the FSVP importer. So that's something that we're finding. Investigators have been requesting translation of records because obviously when you're dealing with imported goods, more often than not, the facilities are located in countries where English is not the primary spoken language. When responding to an FDA inspection or list of observations, be sure when you're sending your documentation that it's translated into English. Even if your staff can read and write in the native language of the documents that you've received, it's important that for FDA's purposes, you provide an English translation, because FDA will knock pretty much any document that isn't written in English because they just can't review it or read it. Also, because of the differences between the FSVP requirements and the majority of other food regulatory requirements, FDA's rolled out a new form to document observations for FSVP, and this is a 483A, whereas before, food facility inspections are documented through a FDA form 483. This 483A is specifically tailored for FSVP importer inspections. Since we talked about this new method of doing remote FSVP inspections by FDA, FDA has implemented this FSVP importer portal, which provides a mechanism by which importers can submit their records and documentation in response to FDA requests. It's a way to securely upload these documents, and much like many of FDA's other electronic systems, it's not 100% user-friendly. On the spectrum of easiest to hardest, it's on the easy side, surprisingly, but it's still a bit tricky. So if you have any trouble with it, let us know. We'll be happy to help you through that. Next, let's talk a little bit about enforcement. So this is just the FSVP inspections that have been conducted by FDA. And you can see they've gone up significantly, obviously taking a hit in 2021, only in the fact that I don't think that this figure is complete for fiscal year 2021. I mean, Emily, am I right on that?
It's updated as of October 21st, but I don't believe that it reflects September, August, and October, or September and August inspections.
Yeah. So it's a little bit, it looks like it's a little bit lower, but my guess would be it'll probably be equivalent to the 2020 numbers once the additional months are calculated.
Yeah, and note that it's based on fiscal year, not calendar year, and
Right.
FDA's fiscal year starts October 1 and ends September 30. So for 2021, we had at least 3 months, Q4 basically, of calendar year that is covered, and then not for the rest of this year. So just keep that in mind. That's why the numbers might look a little wonky.
Right. Yeah. The majority of the inspections are voluntary action indicated. That means there were some observations, but it was left to the importer to resolve with notifying FDA. A very, very small amount were official action indicated. That would be either a warning letter or being put as part of the import alert. And then 38%, which is actually a fairly high rate, were no action indicated. So those are the figures. We can see that in 2017 and 2018, there really weren't a lot of OAI inspections. They started really picking up in 2019, and 2020 was where you see the bulk of them. As I said before, the most common observation in all of these is the fact that it was just the failure to develop a FSVP program. That's the number one observation. And that, from my perspective, having been in enforcement, that makes a lot of sense, especially with the new program. The predominant issue is always going to be companies just weren't aware of it, weren't weren't adequately informed, and so are just ignorant of the requirements. When we went through the warning letters, the 95 warning letters that we found that cited failure to develop an FSVP, 85 out of the 95 really just targeted the fact that there was no FSVP whatsoever. Also reviewing the warning letters, we found 6 were related to cheese and yogurt products, which, if you're thinking about 95 warning letters, is not that high a rate, which doesn't suggest that FDA is targeting cheese or dairy specifically on FSVP issues. We did see a lot of follow-up on salmonella-related issues. When there's reported outbreaks, we did actually note a number in mushrooms, for example, where FDA was very focused on that particular segment of food. But anyway, that for cheese and yogurt and dairy products generally, we didn't really find that there was any systematic targeting in what we could see.
Yeah, and on that, generally those products were imported by importers who may be importing a wide variety of goods. They just happen to have cheese and yogurt products as well. So it was not generally what we would see as your traditional specialty cheese importers who are always importing those types of products. Because by and large, we've heard from FDA that for the most part, the cheese importing industry has been doing a fairly good job with at least having FSVPs meeting the minimum regulatory requirements.
Additional FSVP observations that we noted, we talked about at the beginning of this section, not providing an English translation of the FSVP records. It's fairly simple, well, not simple when you get to translate them, but it's an easy fix. If you're responding to a 483A or a observation, or you're uploading documents through the portal, make sure they're in English, or you at least have a translation accompanying them. And it doesn't have to be like an exhaustive translation necessarily. I mean, it can be handwritten in if need be, or on a bulleted list that accompanies the documents. FDA can figure it out. Failing to maintain an FSVP program for all products. Sometimes 50 different products coming in, and you can have one fall through the cracks. Sometimes that's something that FDA was jumping on. Failing to conduct a hazard analysis for each type of food imported to determine whether there were any hazards requiring a control. Again, that's a fairly primary piece of the process. You have to do that review to make sure that's being done. As Emily mentioned, technical errors, they're easy to fix, but they're also easy for FDA to spot when you don't sign or date a record, or you use poor record-keeping practices like signing in pencil or erasing signatures or doing other types of things that FDA frowns on. Making sure that FDA provides you with the notice, you respond as quickly as possible, and you meet the time frame that's set out by FDA. We did note that there were instances where FDA cited the failure to promptly respond to FDA. I mean, some of the no FSVP warning letters actually cited the fact that the importer never even responded to the 483A, which is a significant issue. Failure to maintain records for 2 years from the date of creation, failure to establish and follow adequate written procedures. Essentially, you're supposed to have procedures written that you will be following when you're doing your FSVP program. see if there's anything else that jumps out at me, because there's a lot of these. That failure to establish and follow written procedures to ensure that imported foods are only from foreign suppliers the importer has approved. And this goes back to the exception that we talked about. Going with a supplier that you haven't conducted an FSVP program for is really an exception. You really, granted, under COVID, the import process is strained, but you really need to make sure that all importers go through this FSVP. Emily, am I leaving anything out
No, I think you've hit all of them. I think kind of just to summarize kind of what we're seeing and what steps you should take based on this information is kind of, I would go through some of these observations just as like a checklist. Are you making sure that things are signed and dated when they're supposed to be? Do you have your written procedures? You may think that they look good, but take some of these ideas and go back to just do a quick look at your plan, or if you think about it, what an inspection would be like. Because if you notice, a lot of these are very small technical things. Like, I would not expect that the majority of the people on this call that FDA would walk in the door and not have an FSVP of some kind. You will have some kind of plan in place, but some of the smaller technical things like signing documents that are just like easy and quick for FDA to spot, definitely make those corrections, because if they can find the small things, then they'll dig deeper to see what else might be wrong. And then also that hazard analysis piece on making sure that all your products are covered, especially if you're grouping them for certain suppliers. So like I said, you're grouping all of your soft rind cheeses together because they have similar hazards according to your hazard analysis. And that's how you've decided to maintain your plan. You should really make sure that you include a list somewhere in that plan of all products that are covered by that particular one. It can be an addendum to the plan that's easily updated. I would recommend dating that, just making sure that FDA sees that if you do have some new product, it is covered by some plan. And then also, when it comes to inspection enforcement, we're seeing that FDA, they've been very active in the space of a lot of the warning letters, especially the initial warning letter under FSVP that FDA issued. It was in response to a large foodborne illness outbreak in the United States. And it was a company that said, FSV what? And that's not the response that FDA obviously wants to hear. And we're well past that, because that was in, I believe, 2019 was the first warning letter. So it's good that you need to be educated, and anybody who's interacting with FDA, one of the things that we've seen and learned from our preventive controls inspections as well is that sometimes they want to talk to other people just to see if they have an idea of what their role is for food safety within your company, and understand maybe not all the details of your food safety plan, but or your FSVP plan, but they'd like your employees to understand their role within food safety as a whole, which I know can be hard for imported foods, especially if you're just an FSVP importer and then the food gets immediately sold to someone else or very quickly. But it is something to definitely keep in mind. And like Seth said, we're seeing failure to maintain or create an FSVP as the #1 violation under this regulation. It's actually FDA's #1 citation overall for all foods. And I think a lot of that is stemming from the fact that there's confusion under who is the FSVP importer. So that is one thing that you really, really need to hone in on, especially if you're importing products under a dairy import license, because you are the owner of the cheese or the dairy product being imported under that USDA issued license at the time of import. So you may have other regulatory programs that indicate that you are the owner or the consignee of the food and not expect it. So that is something you should keep in mind. I don't necessarily know if FDA has fully grasped those things together, but because that's reflected on your ACE import documents that you're submitting, that would indicate to FDA that that entity whose license is being used is the owner of the food, because you have to own that cheese or that dairy product that's coming in under license. So then therefore you should be also listed as the FSVP importer. And you cannot sign an agreement that says Seth is going to actually be the one who does the FSVP for me, even though I'm the one who's technically the FSVP importer.
Although that doesn't prevent you from having that person act as the third party FSVP reviewer, but you are the one who's responsible about their review, if that makes sense. I'm glad Emily pointed it out because it's unique that partly I think it has to do with the way that FDA's enforcement scheme is set up for other foodborne issues and food enforcement generally, is that under Part 117, there's a whole number of things that could go wrong in different areas. So a problem in food production facility could be any number of different sources, whereas under FSVP, the requirements are fairly straightforward. And generally, if you don't have it, that's generally the main problem. But, you know, it is the most common issue. Now, maybe part of that too is because of COVID-19's depressing the number of inspections that FDA is conducting on site, but it's still important to point out. Now, the key though here is what can FDA do? Now, we talked a bit about it, the opening, that because of the appearance of adulteration, FDA has greater authority to block imports coming into the US. By failing to have a Foreign Supplier Verification Program, FDA can put you on an import alert, which can prevent you from bringing product into the US. Now, for anyone who isn't familiar with the import alert process, it's basically a red list where if you show up on the import alert, whenever a new entry comes in and your name's on that list, you're immediately flagged for further review and refusal or potential refusal. So if you were failing to follow Foreign Supplier Verification Program for cheese products and now you're bringing in medical gloves or something else, you still could get flagged and it could delay the import, but they might release that product. But if it's a food, they could potentially refuse it if you haven't overcome the issues that related to you being placed on this import alert. And getting your name off of an import alert is oftentimes difficult. Sometimes it takes up to 3 separate entries to overcome an import issue. Now, for something like an FSVP failure, if you can show that you're in compliance, maybe once or twice might be sufficient, but typically we found that it requires multiple entries in order to overcome the issues. Based on what we've seen so far, there are 20 importers currently listed on this import alert. And that's where things are at.
Yeah, and they cover a wide variety of products and foods. So it just kind of depends. But those are companies that, I mean, FDA/CBP doesn't even inspect your just denied entry. So we would like everybody on this call to absolutely stay off that list at any time. So I know we only have a few minutes left as part of the presentation prior to the Q&A section. So we're just going to touch briefly on the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program, as well as the Accredited Third-Party Certification Programs, because they work closely together with FSVP and the preventive controls, but they're not requirements. So VQIP is a program that FDA touts quite a lot. They really want more people to participate in this voluntary program that will provide you expedited review for foods that are imported. And I am not going to read you the eligibility criteria that are on the right side of your screen, but they are there. The biggest barrier to entry for most companies that we have seen is that this is a user fee funded program, Therefore, in order for you to participate on an annual basis, you have to pay a fairly significant fee to FDA in order to participate. And that's what we hear from most members. FDA wants more and more people to be involved because theoretically, the more companies that are involved, the lower the user fees might be. However, we're not seeing wide scale adoption of this. However, if it is something that you're interested in, it is something that you can take a potential advantage of to receive that expedited review when you're importing foods. I will say with COVID, we had heard some issues related to slowdowns and entries, but most of that was related more to the special cheese sampling assignment that FDA was conducting. But for the most part, entries were clearing on a normal basis. So they didn't necessarily see the advantage for the cost of VQuip, but it is worthwhile to mention. Additionally, there is an accredited third-party certification program. So this isn't something you would participate in as an importer, but you would receive accreditation from one of these certificate programs regarding your food safety program to qualify for VQuip or potentially an import certification. Again, this isn't required. The next slide outlines kind of what the process is and the programs that are already recognized as accredited third-party certifications. And again, it has some advantages to where you would go to them to receive the certifications that you may need to qualify for those programs, but they're not required, but they would just help you with faster clearance of your products through the entry process. And man, we hit perfect for timing. I see that there are a couple of questions in the chat, but this is Seth and mine's contact information. The slides, I believe, will be available for all attendees. So feel free to reach out to us if you have additional questions and aren't able to stay on for the next couple of minutes for additional Q&A.
Well, thanks, Emily and Seth. Really appreciate it for a great seminar. I'll jump right into some of the questions that we received. The first one was regarding the ITAC system and just generally speaking, how that works and how FSVP docs should be submitted.
So ITAX does not really work well with FSVP is the best way to put it. That is more a system that you and your customs broker can use to receive FDA notices regarding your entry, whether there's additional documentation or information they need, and where your product is in the clearance process. If you're asking about the information regarding what is included on the entry, specifically regarding FSVP importer, as well as that contact information, that's something that would be done directly on the entry, not necessarily through ITAX. Because if I'm remembering correctly, that information is generally submitted through the customs ACE database as part of your prior entry or your prior notice, as well as the entry documentation. And then if FDA does request information like documents, copies of records from you, you would use the FSVP importer portal. If that's what you would like to use, you can coordinate alternative methods with FDA. But because your FSVP documentation may contain confidential business information, I would recommend it not include trade secret information, but definitely it'll have some CBI for your company. The portal will likely be the most secure way to upload that information to FDA, recognizing that it is not as easy as attaching a copy of your plan to an email. Seth, any other thoughts on ITAX?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I mean, with ITAX, it could be a situation where you find it's faster to, for example, if you're dealing with a situation where your entry is under a hold, it might be easier to overcome it if you want to submit it through ITAX, but generally I'd recommend using the portal.
Hey, we also received a question regarding if a US firm also owns facilities in a foreign country and imports products from that foreign facility, is that foreign site subject to FSVP rules?
So the foreign site is not responsible for FSVP. You as the importer are responsible for FSVP. The foreign supplier is subject to the preventive controls rules though, because that applies equally to domestic as well as foreign facilities. Your role, even as an FSVP importer who is related to that foreign supplier or that foreign company, are still required to say, yes, they meet the FSVP requirements.
I think you touched on this a little bit during the presentation, but one of the questions was what specific areas has come up in FSVP inspections, and what are common questions and concerns that have been brought up? I know you touched on it, but maybe if you want to highlight a few big ticket items.
I think the big things, especially that come up, are documents not being translated. You might be able to read them, but I'm going to tell you, FDA cannot. That is not to say that they do not have very educated staff who can read other languages. They just, because other entities and individuals within the agency may be reviewing these documents, they need them in English. That's a big thing that they will ask you. And it's annoying, and translating documents can take a long time. Seth and I sometimes have to do rough translations when we're dealing with things for a client who doesn't have a document translated, and we've got to communicate with FDA about it. Another area, one of the things that I've found in most of the inspections is, well, FDA is moving towards focusing on regulation. They're still very much so trying to educate, and also they want to have a conversation with you. I know it's adversarial, and you're just always worried about something not being right or getting caught on some small technicality. But the big thing that you need to do as the importer and the entity responsible with FSVP is really you just need to be really knowledgeable about your plan, what's in there, what steps you're taking, and just be able to explain it to them. That's really the big thing that they want, is really to have you just be knowledgeable and be able to have a conversation about what's in your plan and what you do and why you're doing it. That's the big thing. And I always feel that's the best approach to take. Inspectors are people too. That's the big thing. Seth, anything from you on that?
Yeah, no, honestly, I think with something like FSVP, where it's really more of a verification as opposed to doing a food safety plan from scratch, FDA just wants to know that it's being done appropriately. That's why, you see the majority of observations related to just the lack of an FSVP program altogether. Getting into some of the minutia or details on whether the steps you've taken are adequate or not, that gets really difficult for FDA to take an enforcement position over. So, it's easier for FDA just to say, do you have it or not? And as long as you have something that's adequate, I think that's going to solve most of these issues.
A question came in while you were answering that regarding the translation of the documents. Do they have to be translated by the supplier, or is it okay if the importer translates the documents themselves?
As long as it's in English, FDA does not care. It doesn't have to be a certified translation. Just make sure that you are not misrepresenting the translation in any way. That's going to be the big thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter who does the translation.
And Michael, I see there's another question regarding the hazard analysis. And if you're conducting one and your foreign supplier isn't controlling a hazard you identify, yeah, that is actually something. If you've identified a hazard that your foreign supplier is not addressing in their preventive controls plan, you have to push back on them and tell them to do it. That's kind of the role. It's very awkward as an importer, but that's what FDA expects you to do through FSVP, because you've identified a hazard that has to be controlled or can be controlled and significantly reduce the likelihood of an illness or injury. You have to go back and say, this is a hazard we've identified that you're not addressing. Can you please explain why you're not addressing it, or how you are addressing it, and why it's not reflected in your plan? Again, it's really awkward, especially in a country that we have some kind of equivalency or other kind of recognition of food safety programs. But again, that does not mean that it meets the preventive controls requirements just outright. Because, I mean, we all know an audit of a facility or an inspection of a facility is a snapshot in time. And FDA is kind of asking you as an importer to take a step further. And that's part of the whole focus of FSMA is we are being proactive about food safety, not reactive. Because before FSMA, we had some preventative requirements in CGMPs and those other things, but we were not focused on hazards in the same way that we are now. And that's what FDA is asking you to do.
What about qualified individuals? Are you able to have multiple qualified individuals? Maybe one person in your company meets certain needs. Can you supplement that with another person?
Absolutely. One of the things that we found that's been really helpful for some of our clients, whether it's complying with the preventive controls rule, FSVP, or the intentional adulteration rule, sometimes it's important to have a team help you set up that plan. You still have to have a qualified individual, at least one. Some companies have multiple qualified individuals participating in that plan, but you can absolutely change qualified individuals. It's just something that should be documented, especially if your plan is now being reviewed and kind of managed by a different qualified individual. Just make sure that that is appropriately reflected, and you also have copies of the justification as to why they're qualified.
And it also doesn't have to just be your employees. You can have third parties, consultants, whoever helping on that as well.
All right. So, well, thank you, Emily and Seth, and thank you everyone for joining us today. All right. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.